Behavioral economics for businesses. Joining us for this week's Smith Business Close-Up is Rebecca Ratner, an associate professor of marketing at the Smith School of Business. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I've heard of behavioral finance. What is behavioral economics?
Yeah, well, behavioral economics is closely related to behavioral finance. Behavioral economics is basically the study of how social factors, psychological factors, and, including emotion, impact decisions that individuals and groups might make that have economic impact. So these could be, for example, purchase decisions or any kind of individual investing decisions. That's when you start turning to behavioral finance.
So this is really important stuff, and your research looks at how startups in particular make mistakes in this area.
Yeah, well, the research that's done in this field, it does not look exclusively at startups. It's really general research, and the beauty of that kind of research is that it's relevant to startups, it's relevant for larger companies. This particular event that I participated in was called StartupOnomics, and what that event did is it gathered together about 65 domestic startups and about 20 Israeli startups who were streaming in from Tel Aviv at Google headquarters there. And the startups, they're very agile, and so they were really looking for tips about how to use these basic findings from the field of behavioral economics for their startups.
So can you give me an example? What did they want to know?
Sure. They want to know how to be successful using how humans behave. So they want to understand human nature, how do consumers behave in ways that will allow the startups to reach out better and impact the behavior of those consumers. So for example, many of the startups are trying to attract new customers. Some of the startups have customers, but they're trying to keep the customers engaged in what it is that the startup offers. And so by understanding psychological principles, we're able to offer some advice to those startups about how to appeal to those human beings who are their consumers.
So do those human beings act in predictable ways or sometimes in ways that you wouldn't expect?
This is a great question. And luckily for the field of behavioral economics, people behave in ways that might seem irrational, for example, driven by emotion or driven by factors we might have thought wouldn't impact them. But the good news is that people are predictable in how they deviate from what we might expect. So some have called this predictably irrational. And in fact, the organizer of the StartupOnomics event is a researcher and very prolific writer named Dan Ariely, who's actually on the faculty at Duke. And Dan has been very visible in promoting the findings in the field, his findings, but also others' findings to general audiences. So we're very grateful for that.
So with everything you know about this field, does that make you a better consumer? Or are there some behaviors that you avoid or you try to focus on?
This is a very good question. That is a tough one, and I know this is a tough one for a lot of people in my field. Whenever we're asked this, we're not quite sure how to respond. I'm sure I am more deliberate about certain kinds of things. One thing that I've been studying in my own research recently is goal pursuit, and so some of the things that I've learned in studying about goal pursuit have, I think, been helpful for me. For example, in developing a goal as a consumer to do your best is not nearly as effective as developing a very specific goal with concrete steps. So that sort of finding is the kind of finding that I am able to remember and enact in my own life.
And in terms of the startups that were being counseled in StartupOnomics,
yep.
is the idea here that they should be paying attention not to what not to what they think the customer is going to want, or what the customer thinks they want, but actually what on some deep level the customer's really driven by? Am I getting it?
Yes. Let me give you two examples. One example of the kind of behavioral economics finding that we were talking about with startups relates to choice overload. And the idea is that even though we might think that consumers are better off to have more choices, in fact, consumers get overwhelmed when they have too many choices. And so the behavioral research on this makes it very clear that by reducing the number of choice alternatives that we put in front of a consumer, we can make it more likely that they would even take any action to choose any of the alternatives. So that's the kind of information that could be useful to a startup, because it would suggest that when they're pitching a product to a new customer, a new client, that they shouldn't be putting so many different options on the table. They should really be simplifying the process for the consumer. A related idea that we talked about at the event was that consumers really need to understand what steps they should take in order to complete the action that would be in their long-term interest. So one thing I should point out about this particular StartupOnomics event is that we were working with startups that have societal good as part of their mission, which is very relevant to the Smith School of Business, because we have a very active group here that's interested in what we call social value creation. So that was definitely a theme at the StartupOnomics this year, was how can startups help consumers meet their own goals around things that are in societal interest. So for example, helping people save money for retirement, helping people get more exercise, helping people manage stress, helping people, did I already say eat a healthier diet? That's one of my personal favorites. So that was one that I was talking with them about a lot.
All right. Good stuff. Rebecca Ratner joining us from the Smith School of Business.